Catherine Speck is Professor of Art History and Coordinator of Postgraduate Programs in Art History and Curatorial and Museum Studies at the University of Adelaide and the Art Gallery of South Australia. Her publications include Painting Ghosts, Australian Women Artists in Wartime, and Hessen and Hessen, Selected Letters of Hans Hessen and Nora Hessen, and most recently, Beyond the Battlefield, Women Artists in the Two World Wars. She is also the author of numerous articles on Australian art and a co-researcher on an Australian Research Council project, Australian Art Exhibitions 1968 to 2009, which is exploring how key Australian art exhibitions prefigure and shape art history. Please join me in welcoming Catherine Speck.
Thank you. Do I turn the lights down? Or they'll just go down? Okay. Britain and America approached the visual record of the war in differing ways, each being aware of the employment scheme of artists in times of national need. Each being aware of the other's employment schemes of artists in times of national need. This paper focuses on the to and fro of information about such programs and the quite different ways each nation approached employing or commissioning artists, and women in particular, so that there would be a visual record of the conflict. We turn first to Britain prior to the announcement of war, and how Sir Kenneth Clarke, the director of London's National Gallery, was already considering the role of artists in the coming war everyone considered inevitable. Uppermost in his mind was how his country during the First World War had been slow in developing a scheme to employ artists, and how some, like Henry Gaudier-Bresca, enlisted and were sent to the front and subsequently died. He was determined that this time he would employ artists rather than seeing them called up. He was familiar with how the American government during the Depression commissioned artists on mural projects like the Federal Arts Project, and he thought that Britain, with 73% of artists unemployed, needed a similar scheme. America, meanwhile, had no such thoughts about the role of artists in wartime. Clarke knew he needed to move quickly. By late September 1939, he already had a list of 51 male and female artists who could be employed, and he'd formed a committee for the employment of artists. In wartime, and it had already met. By early November, he'd reached agreement with the Ministry of Information that the production of art relating to war should come under their ministry, and also that on the 16th of November, Minister Harold Macmillan, a supporter of the arts, had approved the formation of the War Artists Advisory Committee, the WAAC that you heard Cassius talk about. The WAAC was a smooth and effective committee. Kenneth Clarke had selected members carefully with a perceived balance of tastes and interests, and the three armed services agreed to select only artists recommended by the WAAC. Membership of that committee changed during the war years, but Clarke remained the chair and the dominant force, and he gave shape and direction to the WAAC. That direction often corresponded to the particular and shifting course of the war in Britain, which was under attack, as we've heard in the previous paper, for much of the time, and the public display of paintings, drawings and prints by war artists was a key morale-lifting element in the total British response to the war. By the 15th of December 1939, the British War Art Programme and what it would achieve was the subject of a BBC radio broadcast in which artists were advised to make contact, and they did. 37 artists were subsequently given full-time commissions, just one of which went to a woman, Evelyn Dunbar. Ethel Gabain, whose work you see here, and Dorothy Coke were also given short-term contracts, and those three appointments, along with that of 5 male artists, were announced in the Times on the 25th of April 1940. A further 8 women artists were eventually given contracts, and art was purchased from 34 others, some of whom are considered in this paper. The employment or the commissioning of women as war artists in Britain had a history. Anna Airy was commissioned during the First War to document work in munitions, while the Imperial War Museum's Director-General, Sir Martin Conway, nominated, and these are his words, the work of women both directly for the war purpose and indirectly by substitution as one of its collecting areas, right from the time of the Imperial War Museum's establishment in 1917. Clearly, in Britain, there was some cognizance of the fact that while wars then involved male citizens in warfare, this could only occur with all the material and emotional support from the home front, and that women assisted as nurses and voluntary aides behind the front. So it was not unexpected that women were appointed or commissioned as war artists in the Second World War. In America, meanwhile, well before Pearl Harbor, artists, arts organisations and arts publications were already engaging with the cultural dimensions of the war. Life magazine's editor, Henry Luce, backed his country's intervention in the Second World War, and on the 17th of February 1941, he advocated moving from its regional and isolationist stance to one of concern with global issues. Both the Magazine of Art and Art News ran stories on the intersections between art and war, and in June 1941, left-leaning artists held a symposium in New York on the need to defend art and culture from fascism. They staged a large rally on the 6th of June 1941 at the Manhattan Centre. Also, in mid-1941, in reviewing the touring exhibition Britain at War that several of our speakers have talked about, and on show at MoMA, Margaret Varga, a regular writer for the Magazine of Art, wrote, "America's artists are as eager to do their part as Britain's. All they need is a signal from the government. In the past 7 years, through the program for the documentation of public buildings, they've brought America closer to the hearts of the people. They stand ready now. While the country needs every citizen's cooperation, why has not the government harnessed this force to service in the way it's most needed at this time?" Now, the conditions were very different in each nation, but also, and this is the main theme of this paper, the way each government harnessed the service of its artists, and women in particular, differed radically. Britain's artists quickly found themselves in the middle of a war, especially as we've heard in this last paper. From the 7th of September 1940 to the 21st of May 1941, Germany inflicted sustained bombing on highly populated areas, and 1 in 6 Londoners lost their homes, and women and children and the elderly were vulnerable. Britain mobilised their entire population in order to survive, and much of the British women's art commissioned by the WAAC records these and other pressing issues. Realist lithographer Ethel Gabain was a key artist in documenting how ordinary people coped and contributed in a war being fought on their home front. For instance, she was commissioned by the WAAC to document the movement of 100,000 children under 5 and 1 million school-aged children to the safety of the English countryside, where they were placed in foster homes. And here, in the work you see in front of you in the evacuation of children from Southend, Gabain shows each child equipped with essential supplies. These mostly anxious children were quite unaware they were part of a well-meaning mass movement which has been referred to as the greatest upheaval in modern Britain. Gabain felt that the courage women showed in keeping up the daily work while the home front was being attacked needed to be documented, and in fact she had to push that point with the WAAC. And here in Demolition, Brick Sorting and Chipping, she shows a group of women from the Islington borough, an area that had suffered much damage. They have the daunting job of turning mountains of bricks from bombed buildings into useful recycled material. The reality of the war on the British home front was that each and every citizen was involved in some way. Evelyn Gibbs was commissioned by the WAAC to show how the Women's Voluntary Service of Civil Defence stepped in to assist those who lost everything in air raids by supplying garments for people in need. And here, in the VWS Clothing Exchange, Gibbs shows 2 volunteers in their distinctive green uniforms finding clothing for women and children. In addition to focusing on the everyday, Ethel Gabain portrayed some of the heroes, such as Pilot Captain Pouline Gower of the Women's Air Transport Auxiliary. Now, Gower was particularly incensed that the RAF wouldn't let women pilots fly planes. So she established a Women's Air Transport Auxiliary, an ATA, and they proceeded to fly planes between Air Force stations and to deliver newly built aircraft to their destination. They flew without radio contact and in all RAF planes except the large flying boats. Royal Academician Laura Knight was contracted too, and in 2 instances when the labour of women was urgently needed, she was commissioned to produce a painting. We're going to consider just one of those. In 1941, when women were being brought into balloon command, the WAAC commissioned Laura Knight to produce a painting that would bring in recruits to work with the barrage balloons. These were balloons filled with helium and attached to wire cables that rose to a height of between 7,000 to 10,000 feet to deter enemy planes. As Harold Peake from the Air Ministry wrote in 1941, although we now have conscription of women, it's not going to be too easy to get just the right sort of person to opt for this particular class of work. Any picture which will provide useful publicity for balloon command will be particularly valuable during the next 2 to 3 months. Laura Knight did just this, and in Balloon Site Coventry, as you can see, she shows the mostly female crew launching a balloon under the very able leadership of their female sergeant. Another crucial aspect to the war was food production. Many farm labourers were serving in the armed forces, and Britain was no longer able to safely import food, so there was a shift to home production. By the end of 1943, 80,000 non-rural women worked in the Land Army, and Evelyn Dunbar was directed by the WAAC to document this. Dunbar was employed continuously as a war artist until the war's end, and she was based at several agricultural sites, including the East Malling Fruit Research Station in Kent. Land Army girls were trained there in how to prune trees directly, and this is the subject of a painting you see in front of you, a 1944 Pastoral. Dunbar worked in the neo-romantic style, and her composition centres around the striking linear qualities in the geometric structure that the 3 ladders give to the women pruning the wayward limbs. It's late autumn, the branches are bare, but a sense of fantasy gives those trees fulsome, rounded shapes. The enduring cyclical nature of the activity, involving the many gloved hands wielding pruning shears, secateurs and saws, frames the subject and underscores it as a neo-romantic pastoral scene so beloved by the British. The subject and how it's depicted implies continuity and certainty when the external world offered no such reassurance. While Dunbar had been busy covering all aspects of food production, including the new technology, including the new technology of canning in a canning demonstration, the WAAC had neglected its focus on nursing. Lady Louis Mountbatten, the administrator of the Red Cross, pointed this out to Kenneth Clarke. So Dunbar was duly directed to Hospital Train 21, one of a fleet of trains converted to ambulances and designed to move those injured in air raids from cities to hospitals or first aid stations in safer areas. And as you can see here in Hospital Train, she shows 2 staff preparing for patients. Again, working in that neo-romantic style, a comforting rendition. A train of 10 carriages could carry large numbers of wounded. With 30 patients on a stretcher per van, it meant 300 plus other sitting injured could be efficiently moved to safety. 500,000 British women joined the various women's services, but the visual record of this mass movement into military culture is extremely slim. Stella Schmolle, who worked as a draftswoman and then in intelligence in the ATS in France and then in Brussels, completed numerous paintings of ATS mechanics, drivers and cooks, such as the dough room that you see here, while Dorothy Coke was one of the few British artists commissioned to record the WAAF servicewomen and the ATS servicewomen on the home front. But really, the WAAC just did not follow that particular part of the war effort. So we've looked briefly at what some of the British women recorded and how the WAAC oversaw appointments and choice of subject matter. We turn now to the United States, who, as we know, entered the war in December 1941. The US government's cultural response was never on the scale of Britain. America, in contrast to Britain, didn't have a record of employing or commissioning women as war artists. The 8, the war artists appointed as official artists in the American expeditionary forces in the First War to go to France to document the American contribution, were all men. Their representational focus, thus, was entirely masculine, despite the fact that America sent large numbers of nurses to France in that war. One of the first changes on the American home front in February 1942 was to declare Japanese Americans displaced persons and to move them into internment camps in Northern California. This prompted the War Relocation Administration of the Office of War Information, the OWI, to commission 2 photo artists, Dorothea Lange and Ansel Adams, to document it. Dorothea Lange knew a good number of the Japanese Americans and she felt the injustice of the situation deeply. Her photograph that you can see here of the 13th of March 1942, I Am an American, shows a local landmark, Wanto's grocery, fruit and vegetable shop, which was forced to close due to the owner's internment. On the day the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, Mr. Wanto felt it necessary to put up a sign, as you can see here, I Am an American, proclaiming his American citizenship. Other photographs, like members of the Mochido family awaiting their evacuation bus, show the patience and the quiet dignity of the dispossessed, and they're wearing name tags, as you can see, issued to keep families together. Lange visited almost all of the 21 camps where those interns were placed. She found people living in very poor conditions and with little privacy. Her officially commissioned photographs were not released, though, until after the war was over. America was particularly slow in forming an army art unit. This occurred in 1943, principally because the Assistant Secretary of War, John McCloy, could see that the Navy, with its 8 active duty male artists, was the only service visually documenting the war. He called in artist George Biddle, a former First World War Army staff officer and well connected politically. Within a short space of time, the Army Corps of Engineers, who'd run that combat art program I referred to in the First World War, established an Army art unit in February 1943 under Biddle's leadership. An initial list was drawn up of 41 male artist correspondents, 23 of whom were already serving and 19 civilians. This list was extended to 59 artists and only 3 were women: Marion Greenwood, Lucia Wiley and Doris Rosenthal. Greenwood was trying to have more women employed. She sent George Biddle a list of 20 women, including Peggy Bacon, Doris Lee and Minna Citron. She followed this up with a letter to Mrs. Henry Morgenthau Jr. of the Treasury Department's Section of Fine Arts Committee, writing, "A considerable number of men artists are already being used to depict the war, both at home and abroad. Now a group of women artists, including myself, are trying to establish themselves on the same basis. 3 women have been chosen to work on the home front, but considering the tremendous scope of war activities and the large number of women artists available, we feel their employment should be greatly expanded." Meanwhile, by March 1943, male artists from the Army Art Unit started arriving in combat zones. However, Biddle was not the best ambassador for the program, and funding was withdrawn by Congress in August 43, as we heard yesterday. By June 44, the active duty artists were reinstated under the arm of the Army's Historical Division, thus affirming its male artists only orientation. The civilian women artists, including Lucia Wiley and Doris Rosenthal, were never contracted, and Marion Greenwood's idea to employ more women failed to eventuate. Marion Greenwood, meanwhile, was taken on by Abbott Laboratories as a war artist in 1944 and 45. This Chicago-based pharmaceutical company had reached an agreement with the American government in 1943 that they would sponsor the formation of an art collection that would serve as a comprehensive record of war activities, and that the collection would become the property of the US government. Abbott Laboratories agreed to cover all the costs and the expenses, while the Associated American Artists nominated the artists and helped administer the scheme. The War Department provided transport and housing. Greenwood was the only woman serving as a war artist under this scheme, and she was based at the Army Medical Department, England General Hospital in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Her assignment was to document the medical treatment and the rehabilitation of injured soldiers from the European and the Pacific war zones. Her works include her tender study you see here in front of you, Brooklyn Kid from Anzio, showing a young soldier whose eyes have a sadness that doesn't match his age, and Exercise Period for the Wounded. Greenwood was a highly regarded mural artist who'd worked in Mexico at the invitation of Diego Rivera, and she was well versed in presenting dynamic group compositions, but here, as you see, suggesting bodily repair. Life magazine, as we've heard in a few papers during the symposium, was also commissioning paintings of American involvement at the front and at home for their wartime issues. Modernist painter Edna Reindel could envisage how Californian women workers at the Lockheed Aircraft Factory and at the Calship shipbuilding yards would make ideal subjects, so she approached the magazine. Editor-in-chief Daniel Longwell liked the idea. Life, too, was in the process of developing an art collection documenting the war, and she was advised that her paintings would enter that collection. Reindel's paintings were reproduced in Life magazine on the 5th of June 1944, one day prior to D-Day. They appeared as a photo essay and contained images of the artist sketching her subjects, and so the photographs underscoring the documentary nature of the assignment. Reindel worked in the style of magic realism. And as you see here in Calship Burner, she shows Rosemary Wiley using her oxyacetylene torch with extreme care to trim an excess strip of metal from a piece of steel destined to become part of the ship's body. The impact of the image in life lies not just in its visual qualities, though, typical of the magic realist style, but its combination of image and text. The Magazine Bureau was liaising with the major magazines based in New York, and they published a language guide, War Jobs for Women. The text was closely aligned with the direction of the American government's campaign around women in war, and when the photo essay appeared in Life, it did so under the header Women at War. The text informed the reader that Rosemary Wiley was a former university student, she'd since married, works the midnight to morning shift, and she expects to stay on the job for the duration. The editorial message is clear. Women are a reserve army of labour for the war effort, that the civilians are helping the soldiers, the real fighters, safeguard America, and that there's a collective spirit of self-sacrifice on the home front. The progressive image that the Magazine Bureau promoted in Life and other magazines was of bright, intelligent women recruited as soldiers of industry. Life magazine also sent Gladys Rockmore Davis to France as an accredited US correspondent to cover Paris at the time of liberation, the army providing transport and accommodation for Life artists. She arrived there very soon after it occurred. She wore the American uniform, as you can see here, and there's a photograph of her being served coffee in a French village. She reported that when the village came under counterattack the following day, she was lucky to escape alive. Gladys Rockmore Davis's paintings of life immediately after liberation include paintings like A Mourner, Paris, showing a young mother dressed in black and her young child at a spot where her husband, a member of the resistance, was killed. Others include Paris, 1944, a rather dark painting showing how shops were unable to open due to lack of supplies, and in fact quite a few of her works are really quite grim. In contrast, her painting School Children is much more cheery. When her work was exhibited in 1945 in the foyer of the Time Life building in New York, the New York Times critic observed she was portraying an uncertain, frightened city, and only the children seemed nourished and at ease. Everything else had a furtive, unreal look about it in those uncertain days before the Rhine was crossed. We turn now to Lee Miller. She was an accredited US correspondent working for British Vogue. In the chaos of war, Miller attached herself to various US Army divisions, and her photographs document the reclaiming of France and other locations in Europe. Her reports for the British and the American editions of Vogue in September 1944 included images like this one, surgeon and anaesthetist, 44th Evac Hospital, showing a medical team behind Omaha Beach in Normandy using the rigged-up equipment typical of field surgeries. She was portraying broken, injured bodies. But what's interesting about this image is that her soft focus photography and lacking a central focus implies, but does not unduly dwell, on the injured subject. It was a remarkably restrained photograph, whereas other American media outlets were deliberately graphic in order to maintain public support for the war. When she arrived in Paris, soon after its liberation, she went to the chastisement of some French collaborators. The initial punishment before the trial was to shave their heads. She provided Vogue readers with on-the-spot visual and textual accounts of life in post-liberation Paris and then the progress of war, and by the 30th of April 1945, she'd reached Dachau. She was present to photograph, She was present to photograph soldiers looking with horror through the open doors of a railway carriage at deceased prisoners, and in doing so, she abandoned her earlier style of restraint. From there, Lee Miller and fellow photographer David Sherman went on to Munich. Arriving there on the 1st of May, they found the 179th Regiment at Hitler's house, and as she said in a letter to her editor, "I was living in Hitler's private apartment when his death was announced." Her Vogue story, Hitlerania, about the incident appeared in July and August 1945, and it included this photograph taken by David Sherman of Lee Miller in Hitler's bath. So, what of the British and the American approaches? Both countries employed far fewer women than men as official war artists, but how they went about commissioning the art differed too. The British, via the WAAC, ran a highly centralised war artist program in which the focus for women artists was on the home front, in a war that was also being fought on their own soil, whereas most of those male artists they commissioned produced work with subjects that tended to relate to frontline and behind-the-front subjects. The American approach, in contrast, was very different. It was highly decentralised and almost wholly privatised. But ironically, for women artists, this meant their range of subjects was broader, and it included active zones of warfare in Europe. Only at the war's end did the British finally send 2 women artists into Germany to record life there, post-war life and the conditions there. Doris Zinkersen, based in Brussels, went to Belsen, and then Mary Kessel to the Bergen-Belsen displaced persons camp. Both produced shocking images of the atrocities of Nazism, including, as you see here, Zinkersen's Belsen, and then Kessel's notes from the Belsen camp. Life magazine did not send women photographers there. So these two nations, Britain and America, linked politically and economically, operated quite differently in relation to the employment of war artists, and women in particular. They were 2 boats rowing side by side, but not meeting up. Thank you.